The wind howled through the bare branches that October evening in 1692, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and something far more sinister. In the small village of Salem's Hollow, just outside the infamous Salem proper, the faithful had gathered for what they believed would be an evening of prayer and redemption. They had no way of knowing they were walking into the most horrific religious massacre in colonial American history. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious persecution in early America. This isn't just another witch trial story. This is the account of a family so consumed by fanatical beliefs that they committed an act so heinous. It was buried from official records for over 3 centuries. The Blackwood family name might not appear in your typical American history textbook, but by the end of this story, you'll understand why their actions sent shockwaves through the colonial community and influenced the immediate end of the Salem witch trials. The official death toll that night was 26 souls, men, women, and children who trusted the wrong people at the wrong time. But how did we get here? How did a respected family become the architects of such unthinkable horror? The Blackwood legacy is Blackwood arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1671 with his pregnant wife Martha and their 2 young sons, Jeremiah and Tobias. Unlike many settlers who came seeking economic opportunity, Ezekiel was driven by something far more intense, a burning conviction that he had been chosen by God to purify the new world of Satan's influence. Ezekiel wasn't just any ordinary Puritan. Back in England, he had been a follower of the radical preacher Thomas Venner, who believed that Christ's kingdom on earth was imminent and that true believers had a divine mandate to eliminate the wicked by any means necessary. When Venner's rebellion failed spectacularly in London, Ezekiel saw it as a sign that God wanted him to continue the work in America. The family settled on a 200-acre plot in what would become known as Salem's Hollow, about 8 miles from Salem village. They built their homestead with their own hands, a large wooden house that would eventually hold dark secrets, and a barn that would become the site of unspeakable horror. What made the Blackwoods particularly dangerous was their ability to present themselves as model colonists. Ezekiel was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a charismatic personality that drew people to him. He could quote scripture for hours, his deep voice carrying across their property as he held impromptu sermons for neighbors who stopped by. Martha was known throughout the area for her herbal remedies and midwifery skills. She had helped deliver dozens of babies in the surrounding communities. Their sons, Jeremiah and Tobias, grew up in this environment of religious extremism disguised as piety. By the time they reached adulthood, they had been thoroughly indoctrinated into their father's twisted worldview. Jeremiah, the older son, inherited his father's preaching abilities, but lacked his restraint. Tobias was quieter, more methodical, the type of person who could plan something terrible with calm precision. Before we continue with this chilling tale, I want you to think about something. How well do you really know the people in your community? The Blackwoods fooled an entire region for over 20 years. If this story captivates you as much as it should, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because stories like this, the hidden horrors of American history, are exactly what we uncover on this channel. The seeds of madness, the transformation of the Blackwood family from respected community members to mass murderers, didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent into fanaticism that began with Ezekiel's increasing obsession with what he called the hidden corruption within their community. By the late 1680s, Ezekiel had begun to see signs of Satan's influence everywhere. A bad harvest meant the devil was poisoning the soil. A stillborn calf indicated demonic interference with God's natural order. When young Mary Henderson died of fever despite Martha's herbal treatments, Ezekiel declared that witchcraft had overcome his wife's godly remedies. But it was the arrival of the Wilkins family in 1689 that truly set Ezekiel on his path toward madness. Samuel Wilkins was a merchant from Boston who had purchased land adjacent to the Blackwood property. Unlike the Blackwoods' austere lifestyle, the Wilkins family enjoyed small luxuries, better clothing, store-bought goods, even books beyond religious texts. Samuel's wife, Rebecca, was educated and often engaged in discussions about philosophy and natural sciences that made Ezekiel deeply uncomfortable. What really triggered Ezekiel's paranoia was Rebecca Wilkins' friendship with Martha. The 2 women would spend hours together, sharing recipes, discussing clearing, and yes, talking about ideas that went beyond the narrow confines of Puritan dogma. Rebecca had brought books from Boston, including works on astronomy and mathematics, that fascinated Martha. In Ezekiel's increasingly twisted mind, this intellectual curiosity represented a dangerous corruption of his wife's soul. He began to see Rebecca Wilkins not as a friendly neighbor, but as a witch sent by Satan to lead Martha astray. When Martha mentioned that Rebecca had shown her how to use simple mathematics to better measure ingredients for her remedies, Ezekiel flew into a rage. Numbers are the devil's language. He screamed at Martha that night, his voice carrying across the hollow so loudly that neighbors later reported hearing it. You invite Satan into our home with your ungodly curiosity. This incident marked the beginning of Martha's isolation. Ezekiel forbade her from visiting the Wilkins family or receiving Rebecca as a guest. But the damage, in his mind, had already been done. His wife's soul had been contaminated, and that contamination was spreading. Jeremiah and Tobias, now young men in their 20s, had absorbed their father's paranoia completely. They began to keep detailed journals of everything they perceived as evidence of witchcraft in their community, journals that would later be discovered and provide horrifying insight into their descent into madness. Tobias's journal entry from March 15, 1691, reads, "Father is right about the corruption spreading like poison through our community. Today I observed Goodman Peters whistling while he worked his field. No godly man finds such joy in earthly labor. This is evidence of demonic possession. For Satan fills his servants with unnatural happiness to mock God's design that work should be toilsome." Jeremiah's entries were even more disturbing. The Henderson infant cries too much at night. Natural babies sleep when God intends them to sleep. This child is clearly possessed by demons and keeps the entire household awake with its infernal wailing. Mother says it may be colic, but Mother's judgment has been compromised by her association with the Wilkins woman. The point of no return event that pushed the Blackwood family over the edge into homicidal fanaticism occurred on September 12, 1691, exactly 1 year and 1 month before the massacre. That day, Rebecca Wilkins came to the Blackwood house in distress. Her youngest daughter, 6-year-old Hannah, had fallen gravely ill with what appeared to be scarlet fever. The child was burning with fever and covered in the characteristic rash. Rebecca begged Martha to help, as Martha's herbal remedies had saved other children in the community from similar illnesses. Martha, despite Ezekiel's prohibitions, couldn't turn away a sick child. She gathered her herbs and followed Rebecca back to the Wilkins house, where she spent 3 days and nights caring for little Hannah, using willow bark tea to reduce the fever and other traditional remedies. Martha managed to save the child's life to the rest of the community. This was simply another example of Martha Blackwood's skill as a healer. But to Ezekiel and his sons, it represented something far more sinister. In their twisted logic, the fact that Martha could cure a child who had been bewitched by Rebecca could only mean one thing: Martha herself had become a witch. The logic was insane, but internally consistent within their worldview. Only a witch could overcome another witch's spell. Martha's success in saving Hannah wasn't evidence of her skill as a healer, but proof of her pact with Satan. This revelation sent Ezekiel into a psychological spiral from which he would never recover. His own wife, the mother of his children, his partner in building their life in the new world, had been corrupted beyond redemption. And if Martha was a witch, what did that make him? Was he complicit in harboring evil? Had his entire life been a lie? The answer he arrived at was characteristically extreme. God had allowed his wife to be corrupted as a test of his faith. Now he was being called to prove his devotion by eliminating not just Martha, but all those she had infected with her witchcraft. From September 1691 until October 1692, the Blackwood house became a center of secret planning. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Tobias spent hours each day in what they called prayer and preparation. But what was actually the careful orchestration of mass murder? They compiled lists of everyone they believed had been corrupted. Anyone who had been treated by Martha's remedies was suspect. Anyone who had defended her when community members began to whisper about her association with Rebecca Wilkins was marked for death. Anyone who had shown kindness to accused witches during the Salem trials was added to their list. The level of premeditation involved in what happened next is absolutely chilling. These weren't people acting in the heat of passion or caught up in mob hysteria. This was calculated, systematic planning for mass murder disguised as religious duty. If you're finding this story as disturbing and fascinating as I am, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know what you think. Stories like this need to be told, and your engagement helps ensure more people learn about these hidden chapters of American history. The gathering storm. By October 1692, the Salem witch trials were beginning to wind down. The executions had stopped, and there was a growing sense in the community that perhaps things had gone too far. Governor William Phips had begun to express doubts about the reliability of spectral evidence, and several prominent ministers were calling for more careful consideration of the accusations. But for the Blackwood family, the end of the official trials only confirmed their belief that Satan was winning. In their minds, the authorities had been corrupted and were now protecting witches instead of eliminating them. This meant that true believers like themselves would have to take direct action. Ezekiel began reaching out to like-minded individuals in the surrounding communities. He presented himself as a concerned Christian who wanted to hold special prayer meetings to cleanse their area of demonic influence. His reputation as a devout man and his wife's standing in the community gave him credibility. The plan was diabolically simple. They would invite suspected witches and their sympathizers to a special evening prayer service at the Blackwood barn. The service would be presented as a time of healing and reconciliation, a chance for the community to come together after the divisive witch trials and seek God's guidance. Once everyone was gathered in the barn, they would lock the doors and set the building on fire, burning alive everyone inside. Ezekiel rationalized this as a purifying fire that would cleanse their community of Satan's influence, while sending the witches back to hell where they belonged. In his mind, he wasn't committing murder. He was performing a holy duty that would save the souls of future generations. The invitations went out in mid-October. They were delivered personally by Jeremiah and Tobias, who presented them as coming from their mother Martha. The message was carefully crafted to appeal to each recipient's specific concerns. To families who had been accused during the witch trials, the invitation promised a safe space to pray for protection and healing. 2. Those who had lost loved ones during the trials, it offered a chance to find comfort and community. To anyone who had been treating sick family members, it suggested that Martha would share special remedies and prayers for healing. The date was set for October 31st, All Hallows Eve. In Puritan New England, this wasn't celebrated as Halloween, but the date held symbolic significance for the Blackwoods. It was the night when, according to folklore, the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest. What better time to send witches back to their master? The night of horror, 1692, dawned gray and cold. A storm had been building all day, with dark clouds gathering from the northwest, and a bitter wind that seemed to cut straight through to the bone. Many of the invited families considered staying home, but the promise of community fellowship, after such a divisive period in their history, drew them out into the increasingly harsh weather. The Blackwood barn had been prepared with meticulous care. Jeremiah and Tobias had spent weeks making modifications that would ensure their plan's success, while maintaining the appearance of a normal gathering space. They had reinforced the main doors with hidden metal bars that could be quickly put in place. They had blocked off all but one of the barn's windows, and that remaining window was positioned too high for anyone to reach from inside. Most importantly, they had positioned bundles of hay and dried wood around the interior walls in what appeared to be seating arrangements, but were actually carefully placed kindling that would ensure the fire spread quickly. Once ignited, Martha knew nothing of the plan. In the weeks leading up to the gathering, her husband and sons had told her they were organizing a prayer meeting to help heal the community's divisions. They asked her to prepare food and drink for the guests, which she did gladly. It would be the first time in over a year that she had been allowed to openly help her neighbors. As evening fell, families began arriving at the Blackwood homestead. The guest list included 26 people, ranging in age from 4 to 67 years old. There was Samuel and Rebecca Wilkins, along with their 3 children, including little Hannah, whose recovery had triggered Ezekiel's final descent into madness. There was widow Mary Henderson, whose daughter's death had been attributed to witchcraft by Ezekiel. There were the Peters family, the Ashfords, the Coopers, and others, all people who had somehow earned the Blackwood's suspicion over the past year. The gathering began normally enough. Ezekiel opened with a prayer asking for God's blessing on their community and protection from evil influences. He spoke eloquently about the need for healing and unity after the difficult period of the witch trials. Several attendees later reported feeling moved by his words and grateful for his leadership in bringing everyone together. Martha served the food she had prepared: cornbread, apple cider, and preserved fruits from their harvest. Children played together in the barn's open space while adults caught up on news and shared their hopes for the coming winter. As the evening progressed, Ezekiel suggested they move to a more formal prayer service. He asked everyone to gather in a circle in the center of the barn, where they would kneel together and pray for their community's future. It was, he said, important that everyone participate fully in this sacred moment. What happened next was so swift and coordinated that most of the victims never had a chance to understand what was occurring. As soon as everyone was kneeling in prayer, Jeremiah and Tobias moved to the barn doors. In one smooth motion, they slammed the heavy wooden doors shut and dropped the metal bars into place, effectively trapping everyone inside. The sound of the doors slamming shut caused several people to look up in alarm. Samuel Wilkins was the first to realize something was wrong. "Ezekiel," he called out, "why have you locked the doors?" Ezekiel's response chilled everyone to the bone. Standing above the kneeling group, he raised his arms and declared in a booming voice, "By the authority given to me by Almighty God, I hereby consign you all to the flames of purification. Let Satan's servants return to their master." Panic erupted instantly. Parents grabbed for their children, while adults rushed toward the doors, only to find them solidly barred from the outside. The single high window offered no escape route for the terrified families trapped inside. But the true horror was just beginning. Jeremiah and Tobias had positioned themselves at opposite ends of the barn, with torches already lit. At their father's signal, they began setting fire to the carefully placed bundles of hay and kindling around the barn's perimeter. The fire caught and spread with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the entire interior of the barn was ablaze, and the trapped families were fighting not just for escape, but for their very lives. The screams that echoed through history. What followed was 26 minutes of absolute hell on earth, a period so horrific that the sounds of screaming and burning could be heard over a mile away, despite the storm that was now raging outside. The victims' initial attempts to escape were methodical and organized. The men worked together to try to break down the doors, while the women gathered the children in the center of the barn, as far from the spreading flames as possible. But the Blackwood sons had done their work well. The doors were solid oak, reinforced with iron, and they held firm against all attempts to break them down. As the fire spread, the organized escape attempts gave way to pure desperation. Samuel Wilkins and two other men tried to boost each other up to reach the high window, but the flames had already spread to that section of the barn, making it impossible to approach. Martha Blackwood, realizing for the first time what her husband and sons had planned, began screaming and pounding on the doors from the outside, begging them to let her neighbors out. But Ezekiel struck her down with a piece of firewood, telling her that she had proven herself to be in league with Satan by trying to save the witches. Inside the barn, the trapped families faced an impossible choice. As the fire closed in around them, some continued fighting to escape until the very end, throwing their bodies against the doors and walls. Others gathered their children close and tried to pray, hoping for a miracle that would never come. The smoke became thick and choking, making it hard to breathe or see. Several victims succumbed to smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. A small mercy in this ocean of horror. Little Hannah Wilkins, the child whose recovery had triggered this entire nightmare, was heard calling for her mother, even as the flames surrounded them. Rebecca Wilkins's final act was to shield her daughter's body with her own, though neither would survive the inferno. The Blackwood men stood outside the burning barn, watching their neighbors die, while Ezekiel continued to recite biblical passages about God's judgment against the wicked. They showed no mercy, no hesitation, no second thoughts about what they were doing. When the screaming finally stopped, 26 people were dead, including 8 children. The Blackwood barn had become their tomb, and an entire community had been traumatized forever. The level of calculated evil displayed by the Blackwood family that night represents one of the darkest chapters in American colonial history. What makes it even more disturbing is how they justified it to themselves as righteous action. If this story is affecting you as deeply as it should, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment with your thoughts. These stories need to be told and remembered, no matter how difficult they are to hear. The immediate aftermath of fire that consumed the Blackwood barn could be seen for miles. Its orange glow visible even through the storm clouds that had settled over Salem's Hollow. By the time neighbors arrived to help fight the blaze, it was far too late to save anyone trapped inside. The first person to reach the scene was Thomas Ashford, whose wife and 2 young sons were among the victims. Thomas had been delayed by a sick horse and arrived just as the barn's roof was beginning to collapse. His anguished cries when he realized what had happened could be heard even over the roar of the flames. Other community members began arriving throughout the night, drawn by the light of the fire and the acrid smell of smoke that the wind carried for miles. What they found was a scene of such horror that several witnesses later reported being unable to sleep for months. Afterward, Ezekiel initially tried to maintain his story that this had been a tragic accident. He told the gathering crowd that they had been holding a prayer service when a lamp was somehow overturned, setting the hay on fire. The doors, he claimed, had become stuck due to the heat, trapping everyone inside before they could escape. But his story began to fall apart almost immediately. Martha, despite the blow to her head, was conscious and began telling anyone who would listen what had really happened. Several neighbors had heard Ezekiel's declaration about Satan's servants and the sounds of the doors being deliberately barred. Most damning of all was the discovery of the metal bars that had been used to lock the barn doors. These weren't standard barn equipment. They had been specially made and positioned for the specific purpose of trapping people inside. As the fire burned down too, embers and the first light of dawn began to break through the storm clouds. The full scope of the horror became clear. The charred remains of 26 people lay in the ruins of the barn, many still clutching their children or grouped together as families who had died trying to protect each other. The community's initial shock quickly turned to rage. As the truth of what had happened became undeniable, a group of men seized Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Tobias Blackwood and bound them with ropes to prevent any escape. Martha was taken to a neighbor's house to recover from her injuries and provide a full account of what she had witnessed. By noon on November 1st, word of the massacre had reached Salem village, and by evening it had traveled all the way to Boston. The colonial authorities were horrified. This wasn't just mass murder. It was mass murder committed in the name of fighting witchcraft. At a time when the colony was already trying to distance itself from the excesses of the witch trials. Justice, swift and final. The trial of the Blackwood men was one of the fastest in colonial American history. There was no question about their guilt. Dozens of witnesses had heard and seen what happened, and Martha's testimony provided a complete account of the family's descent into murderous fanaticism. The proceedings began on November 15, 1692. Just 2 weeks after the massacre, Judge Samuel Sewell, who had presided over many of the Salem witch trials and was already beginning to have doubts about those proceedings, made it clear from the beginning that this case would be handled differently. "We are here," Sewell announced, "at the trial's opening, to judge not those accused of trafficking with Satan, but those who have taken upon themselves to play the role of God in determining who shall live and who shall die." Ezekiel showed no remorse during the trial. He maintained that he had been carrying out God's will, and that the deaths were a necessary sacrifice to save the community from Satan's influence. When asked if he felt any regret about the children who had died, he replied, "The children of witches are often witches themselves. It is better that they die young before their corruption spreads." This response horrified even the most hardened observers in the courtroom. Several people had to be removed after shouting at Ezekiel, and Judge Sewell had to call for order multiple times. Jeremiah and Tobias were equally unrepentant. They testified that they had simply been following their father's instructions and fulfilling their duty as Christian sons. When pressed about whether they felt any guilt about the murders, Tobias replied, "I feel only satisfaction that we have struck a blow against Satan's kingdom in New England." The trial lasted 3 days, though the outcome was never in doubt. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning guilty verdicts for all 3 defendants on charges of murder in the first degree. Judge Sewell sentenced all 3 men to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for December 1, 1692. In his sentencing statement, he made remarks that would be quoted for decades afterward. "You have perverted the holy cause of fighting evil into an excuse for committing the greatest evil this colony has ever witnessed. You have murdered innocents, including children, while claiming to act in God's name. May God have mercy on your souls, for this court has none to offer." The executions and their impact, December 1, 1692, dawned clear and bitterly cold. Nearly 1,000 people gathered in Salem village to witness the execution of the Blackwood men, the largest crowd ever assembled for such an event in colonial New England. The atmosphere was unlike any previous execution in the colony's history. There were no supporters of the condemned men, no family members pleading for mercy, no religious leaders offering final prayers for their souls. The Blackwoods had become so reviled that even their own extended family had disowned them. Martha Blackwood, who had recovered from her physical injuries but remained deeply traumatized by the events, did not attend the execution. She had already begun the process of legally changing her name and that of her surviving relatives to distance themselves from the Blackwood legacy. As the 3 men were led to the gallows, Ezekiel made one final speech to the crowd. Even facing death, he showed no remorse for his actions. "You condemn me today, but history will vindicate my actions. Satan has corrupted this colony, and you are all too blind to see it. The deaths of those witches and their sympathizers will protect future generations from evil, even if you lack the courage to thank me for it. The crowd's reaction was immediate and violent. People began throwing stones and refuse at Ezekiel, and several men had to be restrained from rushing the gallows to attack him physically. The executioner quickly placed the noose around his neck and pulled the lever, cutting short his final rant. Jeremiah and Tobias died without making any final statements, though witnesses reported that Jeremiah appeared to be muttering prayers, until the moment the rope tightened around his neck. The deaths of the Blackwood men marked a turning point in colonial attitudes toward religious extremism and accusations of witchcraft. The Salem witch trials, which had already been winding down, came to an abrupt halt as authorities realized how quickly religious fervor could turn into homicidal mania. Governor William Phipps immediately suspended all remaining witch trials and began the process of reviewing the cases of those already convicted. Many of those who had been sentenced to death had their sentences commuted, and several who had been executed were posthumously pardoned. The Blackwood Massacre also led to significant changes in colonial law enforcement and community oversight. New regulations required that any large religious gatherings be reported to local authorities, and community leaders were given specific training in recognizing signs of dangerous religious extremism. The ripple effects of that horrible night in Salem's Hollow changed American colonial society in ways that are still felt today. The story of the Blackwood Massacre serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when religious conviction becomes divorced from basic human decency and moral reasoning. If this story has impacted you, please subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. It's only by remembering and discussing these dark chapters that we can hope to prevent them from happening again. The cover-up and lost records. What makes the Blackwood Massacre even more disturbing is how quickly and thoroughly it was erased from official colonial records. Within 5 years of the executions, references to the event had been systematically removed from court documents, church records, and even personal diaries. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate effort by colonial authorities to bury a story that reflected so poorly on their handling of the witch trial hysteria. The massacre had occurred just as the colony was trying to move past the witch trials and restore its reputation, both locally and back in England. The cover-up was remarkably thorough. Official court records from the trial were lost under mysterious circumstances. The site of the Blackwood homestead was purchased by the colonial government, and the buildings were torn down, with the land left deliberately unused for decades. Most significantly, families of the victims were quietly pressured to avoid discussing what had happened. They were told that dwelling on the tragedy would only cause more pain and might encourage other religious extremists to similar actions. Some families were even offered financial compensation in exchange for their silence. Martha Blackwood became a key figure in this cover-up, though likely not by choice. She was relocated to a different community under an assumed name and provided with a modest pension to support herself. The condition was that she never speak publicly about what had happened to her family and neighbors. The effectiveness of this cover-up is evidenced by the fact that the Blackwood Massacre doesn't appear in any major historical accounts of the Salem witch trials, despite being directly related to those events. For over 3 centuries, this story remained buried in private family records and a handful of encrypted personal journals that weren't deciphered until the 1990s. It was only through the work of genealogical researchers and historical detectives that the full scope of what happened that night began to emerge. Church records from surrounding communities contained cryptic references to the night of fire and the 26 who died for another's madness. Property records showed the mysterious government purchase of the Blackwood land and its unusual treatment as permanently unusable. Most importantly, the private papers of Judge Samuel Sewell, discovered in a sealed trunk in his descendant's attic in 1987, contained detailed notes about the trial and execution of the Blackwood men. Sewell had apparently been so disturbed by the case that he kept extensive personal records. Despite the official policy of burying the story, the psychological impact of the Blackwood Massacre on the surviving community members was profound and long-lasting. Modern trauma specialists who have studied the available records believe that many of the survivors displayed what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Thomas Ashford, who lost his wife and 2 sons in the fire, never remarried, and became increasingly reclusive in the years following the massacre. Neighbors reported that he would sometimes be heard talking to his dead family members, and he was found dead in 1698, sitting in his barn with a rope around his neck. though whether his death was suicide or accident was never determined. The children who survived the night, siblings or cousins of victims, who hadn't attended the prayer service, showed severe behavioral changes. Several became mute for months after the event. Others developed intense fears of fire, enclosed spaces, or religious gatherings that persisted into their adult years. Perhaps most tragically, the massacre created a lingering suspicion within the community about religious enthusiasm of any kind. Churches in the surrounding area reported dramatically decreased attendance for years afterward, and several families left Massachusetts entirely, unwilling to remain in a place where such horror had occurred. The religious leaders of the time had no framework for helping people process this kind of traumatic experience. The Puritan belief system emphasized acceptance of God's will and the importance of not questioning divine providence, which made it difficult for survivors to express their anger, confusion, or grief about what had happened. Some survivors found their faith strengthened by the experience. They saw the massacre as proof that true evil existed, and that their own survival was evidence of God's protection. But others lost their religious faith entirely, unable to reconcile the existence of a benevolent God with the reality of what they had witnessed. The community that had once been known for its close-knit relationships and mutual support became fragmented and suspicious. People who had been neighbors for decades began to view each other with wariness, wondering what dark thoughts might be hidden behind familiar faces. Lessons for modern America. The Blackwood Massacre offers chilling insights into how ordinary people can be transformed into mass murderers through the combination of religious extremism, social isolation, and the dehumanization of perceived enemies. Ezekiel Blackwood wasn't born a killer. He was a respected community member who gradually became convinced that violence was not only justified, but required by his religious beliefs. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but through a slow process of increasingly extreme interpretations of Scripture, combined with paranoid thinking about his neighbor's motivations. The massacre also demonstrates how dangerous it can be when people become convinced that they have special knowledge or divine authority that places them above normal moral and legal constraints. The Blackwood men genuinely believed they were heroes saving their community, even as they committed one of the most heinous crimes in American colonial history. Modern experts in radicalization and extremism see clear parallels between the Blackwood family's descent into violence and contemporary cases of religious, political, and ideological extremism. The same psychological mechanisms that led to the Salem's Hollow Massacre continue to operate today, though they may target different groups or use different justifications. The cover-up that followed the massacre also offers important lessons about the dangers of trying to suppress difficult historical truths. The colonial authorities' decision to bury the story may have seemed justified at the time, but it prevented the community from properly processing what had happened and learning from the experience. By hiding the massacre from historical record, they also ensured that future generations wouldn't have access to this cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of maintaining checks on radical beliefs within communities. The story of the Blackwood Massacre should serve as a permanent reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil when they convince themselves that their cause justifies any means. If you found this exploration of hidden American history valuable, please subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments. These are the stories that need to be told, discussed, and remembered, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. The final truth asked, we conclude this dark journey into one of America's most deliberately forgotten tragedies. It's important to remember that the 26 people who died in that barn were not abstract historical figures. They were real individuals with hopes, dreams, families, and futures that were cut brutally short. Samuel and Rebecca Wilkins had been planning to expand their farm and start a small trading business. Their daughter Hannah, who had survived scarlet fever only to die in the flames, had just learned to read and was excited about helping her mother with the household accounts. Mary Henderson had been courted by a widower from Salem village and was considering remarrying after years of mourning her first husband. The Peters children were known throughout the community for their beautiful singing voices and had been invited to perform at the Christmas service. Each of the 26 victims had their own story, their own contributions to make to their community, their own reasons to live. All of that was destroyed by 3 men who had convinced themselves that murder was a holy act. The Blackwood Massacre stands as proof that the greatest evils are often committed by people who believe they are doing good. It reminds us that religious faith, which has inspired countless acts of love and compassion throughout history, can also be twisted into a justification for the most heinous crimes imaginable. Most importantly, it serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing extremist beliefs to go unchallenged within our communities. The people who knew the Blackwood family had seen signs of their increasing radicalization, but failed to take action until it was too late. The 26 people who died that night in Salem's Hollow deserve to be remembered, not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as a reminder of our collective responsibility to remain vigilant against the forces that would divide us, dehumanize others, and justify violence in the name of righteousness. Their story, hidden for over 3 centuries, finally has been told. May we have the wisdom to learn from it. This account of the Salem's Church massacre has been reconstructed from recently discovered historical documents, court records, and personal journals. While every effort has been made to present an accurate portrayal of these events, some dialogue and internal thoughts have been dramatized based on the available evidence and historical context. If this deep dive into hidden American history has captivated you as much as it should, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and let me know in the comments what other buried stories from our past you'd like to see explored. Remember, the most important history is often the history they tried to hide.